Cruise staff, what was your worst crisis at sea? It was just another day aboard the Queen Mary 2, or so I thought. Little did any of us know, a terrible tragedy had occurred overnight. That morning, a strange message kept playing over the ship's intercom. The first mate was urgently calling for one of the kitchen staff members to report to his post, but the crew member never showed up. Hours later, the captain made a grave announcement. The missing kitchen worker, who had gotten drunk the night before, had thrown himself overboard into the icy North Atlantic. My heart sank as the reality set in. What happened next was truly remarkable. The captain informed us that the ship was turning around to search for the missing man. 3 nearby merchant ships joined the effort. Despite the thick fog limiting visibility to just 100 yards, nearly every passenger lined the railings, binoculars in hand, desperately scanning the waves. I'll never forget the sight of a wedding party, still dressed in their formal attire, standing alongside the other passengers in the search. They had paused their celebration without hesitation to help. Sadly, after hours of searching, no trace of the man was found. The mood on board was sombre, but the passengers rallied together in support. The concierge desk set up a donation box to send money to the crew member's family in Chile. Contributions poured in from people of all nationalities, using every type of currency imaginable. For the remaining 4 days of the trip, that donation box was filled to the brim. Story 2. I thought I'd seen it all working on a cruise ship, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that day. We were docked, getting ready to depart, when suddenly a bullet struck the navigation bridge. It bounced off the metal and hit my colleague's hand. She screamed in terror, clutching her hand. Thankfully, she wasn't badly hurt, but the shock of it all was too much. She ended up going home for a few weeks to recover. As we waited for the local police to arrive and investigate, the ship's crew had to think fast. We couldn't let the guests find out what had really happened. So we told them that we were delaying our departure to take on fresh water. It was a quick lie, but it worked. To this day, I'm amazed that the truth never leaked out. Story 3. During my 3 years working on a cruise ship, I witnessed my fair share of wild stories. But there's one that stands out above the rest. It all started with a phone call from another cruise line entirely. They were off the coast of Cozumel, Mexico, when they found one of our passengers just floating in the open ocean. Miraculously, he was alive and unharmed. We were all baffled. How did he end up out there? The security team pored over the footage from the night before and made a shocking discovery. In the middle of the night, the passenger, clearly drunk, was dancing alone on deck 5. He was holding his phone and grooving to music only he could hear. Then he did something no one could have predicted. He climbed onto a lifeboat and took a running leap into the dark waters below, leaving his phone behind. Somehow, despite the massive drop, he wasn't injured. The crew theorised that his body was so relaxed from the alcohol that he didn't tense up upon impact. The other cruise ship spotted him and pulled him to safety. Here's the kicker. When the news reached the passenger's family, they had no idea he had even been missing. Turns out, he had booked a separate room from them. When the media caught wind of the story, the passenger claimed that a rogue wave had pushed him overboard. But we all knew the truth. A wave that could reach deck 5 would have been over 40 feet tall, an impossibility. The whole crew buzzed with the tale for weeks before it finally hit the news. To this day, I still can't believe it actually happened. Story 4. I've seen some pretty scary things working on cruise ships, but one of the most unsettling is something most passengers never even think about. The computer systems. Believe it or not, all of the critical systems on the ship I worked on ran on Windows 7. I'm talking about the machinery, space automation, the security system, the fire detection system, everything. And you know how Windows likes to update and restart your computer at the most inconvenient times? Well, imagine that happening to every single computer on a massive cruise ship all at once. When that happens, we're basically flying blind until the updates are finished. It's like the ship's brain suddenly decides to take a nap, leaving us to fend for ourselves. But that's not the only thing that might make passengers uneasy. Holes in the hull are actually pretty common on older ships. Don't worry though, they're easily plugged. It's just a routine part of maintaining an aging vessel. And then there are the fires. I've seen a few in my time on board. But the most terrifying was definitely the crankcase explosion. Imagine a blast of oil mist igniting inside the engine, the force of the explosion bursting through the blast doors. It's enough to make your heart stop. Thankfully, the fire suppression systems are usually quick to put out the flames. The crew barely even bats an eye anymore, but if Windows happens to be updating at the same time, well, let's just say it adds an extra layer of excitement to an already heart-pounding situation. Story 5. Working on a cruise ship is never dull, let me tell you. I've got stories that would make your jaw drop, like the time my friend dealt with a family and their rebellious teenage son. They had just boarded the ship and gotten to their room when the kid decided to do something incredibly reckless. He jumped off the balcony. I know, it's insane. Those balconies are high up and the water below is unforgiving. The crew scrambled to fish the boy out of the water. I can only imagine the panic his family must have felt. But here's the kicker. The whole family got kicked off the ship for the stunt. Talk about a vacation gone wrong. But that's not even the craziest thing I've seen. Did you know that cruise ships have their own little jails? They're called brigs, and they're usually hidden away on the crew floor. The one on my ship even had a one-way mirror. Creepy, right? Most of the time the brig is used for passengers who get a little too rowdy after a few too many drinks. But once, we had to use it for a crew member. One of the entertainers found out his ex was coming on board, and let's just say it made him a little stabby. To keep everyone safe, they had to lock him up in the brig until we reached the next port. Can you imagine being stuck in a tiny room, knowing your ex is somewhere on the same ship? Talk about awkward. Story 6. I'll never forget the cruise my dad and I went on back in 2008. My dad has worked on cruise ships for over 30 years, so he's seen his fair share of strange and unfortunate events. But this one really stuck with me. It started out as a normal cruise, with all the usual activities and entertainment. One of the passengers was an older gentleman who had been a sailor his whole life. Sadly, he had stopped taking his medication and suffered a small heart attack in the ship's cafeteria. The crew acted quickly to provide him medical care, and he seemed to recover. But later that night, the man spent the evening dancing with his family, who had come on the cruise with him. Sometime during the night, he passed away. It was a very public and tragic event. The crew had to keep his body in the ship's freezers until we reached the next port in Greece, where his family disembarked and headed home for his funeral. To prevent panic among the other passengers, the crew told everyone that the man had simply gone home due to a health issue. It was a delicate situation, but they handled it as sensitively as they could. Amazingly, the man's family continued to come back to that cruise line every year, almost as if to honour his memory. Story 7. I'll never forget the cruise I was on where something truly horrific happened just a few cabins down from mine. It was a night I'll never be able to erase from my memory. It started with a couple who were obviously having an affair. They were a married man and woman who weren't with their actual spouses on the cruise. Somehow, they had both gotten incredibly drunk, and in their inebriated state, they ended up falling over the edge of their balcony. And this wasn't just any balcony, it was way up high on the ship. When it was finally reported, the entire cruise ground to a halt as they began searching for the couple. It took almost an entire day before they were found, which must have been the most terrifying, freezing ordeal of their lives. Apparently, the man had managed to inflate his jeans somehow, and they were using that to stay afloat as they were stung by jellyfish. I can only imagine how much pain and fear those two must have experienced, floating in the cold, open water for hours on end, not knowing if they would ever be rescued. It was an unimaginable situation that I'm sure will haunt them for the rest of their lives. The crew did everything they could to find the couple, but it was a massive cruise ship and the ocean is endless. I've never been so relieved and devastated at the same time when they were finally pulled from the water, battered and barely clinging to life. Story 8. Cruising the open seas sounds like a dream vacation, but for the hard-working crew members, it can often feel more like a digital prison. I learned this firsthand from talking to some of the crew on a recent cruise I went on. It seems that many cruise lines, like Carnival, make their employees pay for internet access, and it's not cheap. The crew members I spoke to were constantly lamenting the high costs and slow speeds of the limited internet options available to them. They told me it's not uncommon for them to see the coffee shop closest to the dock packed with crew members, all trying to take advantage of the slightly better Wi-Fi there. One of my friends, who works in network security, even managed to figure out a back door into the higher level Wi-Fi that was supposedly only accessible to senior crew members. While they were careful not to abuse it, being able to make free calls home to their families every night made a huge difference. I can't imagine how isolating it must feel to be cut off from the world for months at a time, unable to stay up to date on current events or easily connect with loved ones. The crew work tirelessly to ensure passengers have an amazing experience, but it seems they're often denied basic modern comforts and conveniences that the rest of us take for granted. Story 9. The joys of life at sea. As a cruise ship crew member, I've certainly had my fair share of unusual challenges to tackle. But the time a burst water pipe soaked all our spare toilet paper during a 2-week voyage to Antarctica, that one really takes the cake. It happened on just the second day of our trip, leaving us with a serious shortage on our hands. With no way to quickly resupply, the cabin stewards had to get creative. They started swapping roles between the low-use and high-use guest cabins, rationing it out as best they could. Let me tell you, it was a real nail-biter trying to make sure no one ran out. The crew worked tirelessly to keep an eye on stock levels and redistribute as needed. Somehow we managed to make it all the way to the end of the cruise without any of the passengers ever catching wind of the crisis. Talk about a close call. These days the crew makes sure to hide extra toilet paper in every cabin, rather than keeping it all in a centralised location. Learned that lesson the hard way, I guess. You can never be too prepared when you're sailing the high seas. Honestly, I'm amazed we pulled it off without anyone being the wiser. But that's the kind of quick thinking and adaptability you need when you're working on a cruise ship. You never know what kind of strange challenges might pop up, so you have to be ready to think on your feet. Story 10. When you think about working on a cruise ship, your mind probably goes to images of tropical drinks, pristine beaches, and carefree passengers lounging in the sun. But the reality is that the crew members face some incredibly high-stakes challenges that most guests never even realise. In my 2.5 years working on a cruise ship, I encountered not one, not two, but 3 major fire incidents. Thankfully, the crew's intensive training and quick actions meant that each fire was quickly contained and extinguished before it could spiral out of control. The passengers, blissfully unaware, would have only noticed their server or cabin steward having to abruptly leave during their shift. Little did they know, those very same staff members had just played a vital role in saving the entire ship from potentially devastating fires. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? We often take for granted the seamless experience that cruise lines provide, never realising the hidden heroics happening behind the scenes. The crew members go through rigorous safety protocols and drills, ready to spring into action at a moment's notice if disaster strikes. And these weren't just minor incidents. I'm talking full-blown fires in crew areas that could have quickly spread throughout the ship. But thanks to the crew's professionalism and expertise, they were able to swiftly bring the situation under control without causing any disruption to the passenger experience. Story 11. Tragedy can strike at the most unexpected times, even during what should be a joyful vacation. That's the harsh reality I witnessed firsthand when an elderly passenger passed away right as our cruise ship was docking in Whittier, Alaska. It all unfolded so quickly. One minute, the passenger was walking down the gangway, the next he had collapsed and died. Our ship's medical team immediately sprang into action, wanting to at least try to revive him. But that's when the conflict arose with the local port authorities. You see, the port security didn't want our crew getting involved, since the incident technically happened off the ship. They claimed jurisdiction, even though our own medical team had far more expertise and equipment to handle an emergency situation like this. It was incredibly frustrating to watch them refuse to even let our chief medical officer perform CPR. With the coroner several hours away, the port authorities had to get creative. They ended up bagging up the poor man's body and storing it in an X-ray machine container guarded by local police until the coroner could arrive and transport it to Anchorage. The man's wife was absolutely devastated, of course. But to the cruise line's credit, they did everything they could to support her during this unimaginable tragedy. They comped her entire vacation, arranged for her husband's remains to be returned home at no cost, and even provided a personal assistant to help her through the remainder of the rail trip to Denali. Story 12. Working on cruise ships certainly has its fair share of oh shit moments, as my buddy next to me can attest. But the biggest one he's ever experienced has to be the time they got stuck in the locks of Amsterdam for over 4 hours, all because of a mine lurking just a kilometre from the front of their ship. Can you imagine the panic and uncertainty that must have set in as the minutes ticked by, with no clear explanation from the captain? My buddy said the passengers were probably getting restless, wondering what on earth was causing the delay. But when the captain finally came on the PA to reveal the shocking reason, a live mine from World War II, I'm sure it sent a collective shiver through everyone on board. Luckily, the Dutch Navy has specialised dive teams that are highly trained in dealing with old unexploded ordnance like this. They must have some serious experience under their belts from all the wartime relics that still litter the waters around Amsterdam. I'm guessing they sprang into action as soon as the mine was detected, carefully surveying the situation and formulating a plan to neutralise the threat. Story 13. As a former cruise ship crew member myself, I can attest that there is certainly no shortage of shocking behind-the-scenes stories from life at sea. The general public has no idea just how much drama and chaos can unfold, even on what appear to be picture-perfect vacations. One of the most haunting incidents I remember was when a crew member working at the front desk jumped overboard after a crew party. It was an absolute nightmare. The poor guy was found a few hours later by the Coast Guard. But the captain had to announce the delay to passengers in order to keep things running smoothly. Of course, that just sparked a flurry of wild rumours among the guests. The crew did their best to keep everything hush-hush, but the rest of that cruise was marred by passengers constantly questioning what had happened. It's a stark reminder of how even the darkest tragedies can disrupt the illusion of carefree relaxation that cruise lines try to project. And that was far from the only disturbing event I witnessed. There was the time a passenger committed suicide in their cabin, while their family, including a young child, was still on board. This time the crew was able to keep it completely under wraps, shielding the grieving family from the prying eyes of other guests. I can only imagine the agony they must have been experiencing. Then there were the more comical, albeit still cringeworthy incidents, like the crew member who got so wasted that he started recklessly urinating all over his cabin in front of the security team. He ended up spending the night in the ship's brig before being unceremoniously dumped at the next port. And of course, there were the persistent urban legends, like the idea that any time we had ice cream in the crew mess, it was because they had to empty the freezer to store a body. Macabre, but evidence of just how prevalent these kinds of stories become among the staff. Story 14. As a former cargo ship worker who has trained alongside cruise line staff, I know there's a whole hidden world of smaller crises and emergencies that the general public never hears about. One of the most fascinating aspects is the coded language that crew members use to discreetly communicate about injuries, deaths, and other sensitive situations. It's a way for them to coordinate a response without alarming the passengers. After all, the last thing a cruise line wants is for guests to start panicking over an incident they overhear mentioned on the public address system. I can only imagine how unsettling it must be for passengers to hear an announcement using some cryptic code, wondering what on earth could be happening behind the scenes. But for the crew, it's a necessary part of maintaining that carefully curated image of a carefree vacation. And you're right, certain cruise lines that cater to an older demographic sadly have to be even more prepared for the eventuality of passenger deaths. Having a dedicated fridge just for storing bodies is a morbid but pragmatic solution. It's a harsh reality that crew members have to grapple with, even as they work tirelessly to ensure the guests never catch wind of it. Story 15. As a professional musician, I've certainly had my fair share of unusual gig experiences, but the one that stands out the most has to be the time I was hired on just 2 days' notice to replace a trombone player who had tragically passed away in a jet skiing accident. When I first stepped onto that cruise ship, the entire atmosphere was heavy with grief. The crew all knew what had happened, and the band I was joining was clearly still reeling from the loss of their bandmate. I had no idea what to expect, stepping into such a raw and emotional situation. The first few weeks were incredibly difficult, both for me and the rest of the ensemble. I couldn't help but feel like an intruder, even though I was just there to do my job. The band members were understandably still traumatised, and I'm sure they were all wondering how I would measure up to the musician I had replaced. But over time, something remarkable happened. As I poured my heart into the music and got to know the crew, the air of sorrow started to lift. The band slowly began to open up, and I could feel a sense of camaraderie start to build. By the end of that contract, it had become one of my favourite gigs ever. I think it was a testament to the resilience and professionalism of the entire crew. They had suffered a devastating loss, but they refused to let it derail the ship's operations or ruin the passengers' experience. And in the process, they welcomed me with open arms, allowing me to become a part of their musical family. To this day, I'm still in awe of how they managed to carry on in the face of such tragedy. I never had the chance to meet the trombone player I'd replaced, but I could feel his spirit living on through the music we created together. It was a humbling and bittersweet experience that will stay with me forever. Story 16. As a passenger on the Costa Serena in January 2012, I experienced firsthand the unsettling aftermath of the devastating Costa Concordia sinking. It was a harrowing and surreal experience that really drove home the human cost of such a tragic maritime event. I remember waking up that morning and immediately noticing the sombre, stone-cold expressions on the faces of the crew and waitstaff at breakfast. Something was clearly weighing heavily on them, and then we were all called to an extra lifeboat drill that had us thoroughly confused. It wasn't until later that day that we finally learned the devastating news. Our sister ship, the Costa Concordia, had sunk overnight. The crew was obviously deeply shaken by the tragedy, especially since many of them had family members serving on that doomed vessel. The lack of information only added to their distress. My now wife, who wasn't on the trip, actually found out about the disaster before we did. She was absolutely terrified, not knowing the exact name of the ship I was on. It wasn't until I was able to get on the ship's internet-connected computer the next morning that she could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Even though we weren't directly involved in the Costa Concordia incident, the gloom and worry that permeated the crew was palpable. We had always viewed those lifeboat drills as a mild annoyance, never realising just how vital they could be. That harsh lesson was driven home in the most tragic way. It took a few days for the crew to regain their composure and for things to return to a semblance of normalcy on board. But the weight of what had happened hung heavy in the air. I can only imagine the grief and trauma that the crew members who lost colleagues and loved ones were grappling with. Thanks for listening to these regrettable recaps. Please like and subscribe if you'd like more of this content in the future, and watch the video that's on your screen now for more regrettable recaps.